The wind howled across the barren plain of Loran, tearing at the flimsy dust storms that swept across the cracked earth like gnashing teeth. It was the kind of wind that scraped the soul raw, that made you question whether anything was worth the effort. In the distance, something somehow moved. Not just the storm, but the landscape itself, the earth shifting under an invisible hand. Dr. Luca Ward stood at the edge of the mining site, his feet planted firmly in the dust, his eyes squinting against the wind. Behind him, the sleek white walls of the colony rose like some kind of monument to human persistence. A persistence that was now being tested by forces far beyond their understanding. Luca took a long drag from his cigarette, watching the horizon. The colony had been on Loran for only 3 years, and already it felt like the planet had started to fight back. Resource extraction was their lifeblood, and they had barely begun to scratch the surface. But every time they mined, drilled, or cut into the earth, the Perton whatever it was seemed to respond with a fury that bordered on violent. They had learned to expect the tremors by now, but today, it felt different. He was right, the ground under Luca's feet trembled. It wasn't the usual deep rumble of the Perton's shifting defenses, this was something faster, sharper. Something closer. His stomach dropped, and for a second, everything seemed to stop. The wind stopped. The dust froze mid-air, then it came at a deafening crack, followed by an explosion of sound as the earth split open with a thunderous roar. Luca's breath caught in his throat, and his heart skipped a beat. He barely had time to react before the ground beneath him buckled and cracked open. The shockwave hit him like a punch to the chest, sending him stumbling backwards, his legs failing to find solid ground. Luca hit the dirt hard, gasping for air. For a moment, he thought he was going to die. But then something strange happened. As the chaos raged around him, the shattering rock, the screams from the crew, the hissing sound of something deep below the surface moving, he saw it. The land, once dry and cracked, seemed to fold inward on itself, roots of some kind stretching from the earth, intertwining, as though the planet was alive and breathing. It was beautiful, in a horrifying way. He forced himself to roll onto his side, coughing as the dust filled his lungs. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shape. Something alive, but not like anything he had seen before. It slithered, like an enormous mass of viscous liquid, wrapping itself around rocks and machinery, its shape constantly shifting, as though it was too vast to settle on any one form. The Perton. Luca's eyes widened in recognition. They had been studying it for months now, but seeing it in person this was something else entirely. It wasn't just a creature, it was part of the land. A defender. A force. And it was responding to them, to their intrusion. The ground continued to tremble, and before Luca could push himself up, he heard the sharp screech of metal and the terrified shouts of the mining crew. They were being consumed, pulled into the earth as if the planet itself had decided they weren't welcome. Luca stumbled to his feet, his heart hammering. His first instinct was to run, to retreat to the colony, but he knew better. There was nowhere to run from this. He grabbed his communicator from his belt, his hands shaking. "Miriam. We need to stop this. Now." A crackling voice responded through the static. "I see it, Luca. We need to pull back. Now. Before it's too late." Luca's teeth ground together as he turned to face the chaos. He wasn't sure what Miriam meant by pull back. How do you pull back from something like this? The Perton wasn't just a creature, it was part of the ecosystem, the lifeblood of Loran. And every time they disrupted the planet, it retaliated in ways they didn't understand. This wasn't just mining. This was a war. As the dust began to settle, the scale of the disaster revealed itself. The hole in the ground was enormous, stretching several miles wide. The machines were buried. The miners, what was left of them, were gone. And in the center of the crater, that thing the Perton seethed, expanding its mass in slow, deliberate motions. Luca knew it was pointless to try and approach now. They were no longer dealing with an alien parasite, but with an organism that was more a part of Loran than humanity could ever hope to be. The Purton wasn't just responding to their actions, it was communicating, adapting, protecting. Luca exhaled slowly, his breath catching as the enormity of the situation sank in. He had thought he understood the Purton, but now he was no longer sure of anything. Miriam, he muttered, his voice hollow, as if the wind itself had stolen his words. We've made a mistake. The journey back to the colony was long, and the sky overhead seemed to be closing in on him. By the time Luca reached the colony's gates, a heavy weight had settled in his chest, one that no amount of science or reasoning could lift. He had known from the moment they landed that Loran wasn't like Earth. He had read the reports, reviewed the studies, but seeing it firsthand, the violence, the ferocity, it made everything feel insignificant. The gates opened with a soft hiss, and Luca stumbled inside. The sterile, artificial lights of the colony contrasted sharply with the harsh, chaotic beauty of the planet outside. He paused for a moment at the threshold, looking back into the horizon. "Dr. Ward," a voice called, cutting through the heavy silence. It was Miriam. "You're late." Luca turned to face her, his eyes dark with exhaustion. She was standing at the entrance to the operation center, arms crossed over her chest. She looked like she hadn't moved an inch since he left, as if she had been expecting this to happen all along. "I saw it," he said, his voice strained. "I saw the Purton. It's not just a parasite, Miriam. It's part of the planet. It's protecting the ecosystem, responding to us. Every time we take something, it fights back." Miriam's eyes narrowed. "You know what the shareholders will say about this. We can't afford to pull back, Luca. We need those resources. We need them now." Luca felt a pang of frustration, the truth he had seen outside, the truth of Loran, clashing with the cold, mechanical mindset of the corporate machine that had sent them here. "We're at a breaking point," Luca said quietly, his tone dangerous. "And if we don't change our approach, we're going to destroy ourselves and everything here." Miriam stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And what's your plan, Doctor? Let the Purton take over? Let the planet decide what we do? We came here to colonize, to mine, to build. We don't have time to wait for some alien creature to adapt." Luca clenched his fists, fighting the urge to snap. "Maybe we don't have to. Maybe there's a way to coexist. To find a balance." Miriam didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gave him a long, assessing look. Then, with a curt nod, she turned and walked inside. "We'll talk more about this tomorrow, Ward. But the clock is ticking. You'd better have a plan by then." Luca didn't sleep much that night. He paced in his quarters, staring out of the small window at the dark expanse of Loran stretching out below him. His mind raced in endless circles, thoughts colliding with each other like broken gears grinding to a halt. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, the Purton, that shifting, roiling mass that seemed to breathe with the planet itself. It wasn't just defending its home, it was alive in ways he didn't yet understand. Alive, and incredibly intelligent. The worst part? He wasn't sure what it wanted, but there was one thing he knew for sure. They had no more time to waste. The colony was on the edge of collapse. The more resources they extracted, the more violent the Purton's response. The cycle was accelerating, and the destruction that followed was just as fast. If they didn't change course soon, it wouldn't just be the miners getting swallowed by the Earth, it would be the colony itself. Luca stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't sit still anymore. He couldn't think clearly trapped inside this sterile, artificial space. He needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who could help. Miriam had already made her stance clear. But he wasn't the only scientist on Loran. There were others, more open-minded, less driven by corporate interests. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of his quarters, his boots thudding heavily against the cold metallic floor as he made his way down the hallway. He passed crew members in the narrow corridors, all of them moving quickly, but none of them meeting his gaze. The weight of the situation hung heavily on everyone. Even in a colony that thrived on the promise of scientific advancement, the shadows of fear were creeping in. Luca found Dr. Elena Wu in the central lab. She was a geophysicist, quiet but razor-sharp, and more than anyone else, she had always shared Luca's belief that the Perton wasn't some mindless organism to be eradicated. It was part of Loran's delicate balance. But even she had her limits. She hadn't been seen much since the last tremor, her usually calm demeanor replaced by the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had already picked a side. "Luca," Elena said as he entered, looking up from a data console filled with swirling patterns of green and blue. "I thought you'd be sleeping." "I tried," he muttered, moving to stand beside her. "But there's something I need to ask you." She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she gestured for him to continue. "Do you think it's possible?" He hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it. "To coexist with the Perton?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to her console, tapping a few keys. "I've been looking at the data from the last few days. It's not like any parasite I've ever seen. It's integrated into the planet's ecosystem. It's a part of it, Luca. The more we damage the land, the more it responds. And it's not just biological. It's almost systemic. Like it's controlling the environment on a level we don't fully comprehend." Luca nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. I saw it with my own eyes. It's not just an organism. It's a defense mechanism, but more than that. He stopped, trying to find the words. "It's a mind. Or at least, it acts like one." Elena tilted her head slightly, considering this. "You're suggesting we communicate with it?" "I'm not sure communication is the right word. I think we need to understand it first. We need to negotiate with it. If we can figure out how to make it work with us, without losing ourselves in the process," Elena finished for him, her voice soft but firm. She was already seeing where this was going. They had both seen enough evidence to know that this wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was an existential crisis. Luca exhaled sharply. "Exactly. If we can find a way to work with it, take what we need without destroying the planet in the process, maybe there's a chance for all of us." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the idea. Finally, she nodded. "It's a long shot, Luca. But I've been thinking the same thing. It's why I've been trying to map the environmental changes. The Perton isn't just reacting to the resource extraction, it's shaping the ecosystem in ways we don't understand. It's as if the planet itself is shifting, evolving. The Perton could be the key to understanding it." He felt a surge of hope. "So, you think it's possible?" "I think it's worth trying. But we'll need to be careful. We're already walking a fine line here. One wrong move, and we could make things 100 times worse." Luca's gaze hardened. He knew she was right, but the urgency was growing. "We don't have a lot of time, Elena. If we don't find a way to make this work, the colony is done for." "I know." She looked down at her console. "I'll help you. We'll need to get samples of the Perton, but we'll need to do it in a way that doesn't trigger another disaster." Luca nodded, already feeling the weight of the next step pressing down on him. But for the first time since the tremors had started, he felt like there was a chance. Maybe not a big one, but a chance. And that was all he needed. Underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. The next day, Luca and Elena prepared to head out into the field, outfitted with protective suits and gear designed to shield them from the worst of the Perton's chaotic responses. They were making their way to the site of the latest tremor, the crater that had swallowed most of the mining equipment. The area was still unstable, the land shifting under their feet as they moved cautiously forward. But Luca was determined. He had a theory, and this was the only place where he could test it. "Elena, do you have the samples?" Luca asked, adjusting the straps on his suit. She nodded, her eyes narrowed behind her visor. "Ready. But we'll need to be quick. There's no telling how long it will take for the Perton to react." Luca glanced out at the wide, empty expanse ahead of them. The sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and earth. The colony felt miles away, a small flicker of humanity against the vastness of Loran. He wondered, for a brief second, if the Perton had been watching them this whole time, waiting for them to realize just how insignificant they were. "Stay close," he warned. "We need to make sure we're not the ones on the menu this time." They moved toward the edge of the crater, where the ground had collapsed, exposing layers of rock and metal buried deep beneath the surface. There were faint traces of the Perton's influence, dark, shifting tendrils that had emerged from the cracks in the earth, wrapping around the remains of the mining equipment. It was as if the land had swallowed them whole, like some ancient beast devouring its prey. Luca took a deep breath. This is it. As he reached the edge, a strange sensation washed over him, like a sudden shift in the air, the planet's heartbeat quickening. He felt it, too. The Perton was here. Watching, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. Not violently, but enough to send a warning, a pulse of energy rising from the earth. "Elena," Luca said, his voice tense. "Get the sample, now." But before she could react, the ground buckled beneath them, a deep rumbling sound that filled the air. The tendrils of the Perton lashed out, fast and unpredictable. Luca tried to leap back, but the earth was already giving way beneath them. The last thing he heard before the world went black was Elena's voice, calm but urgent. "It's here." The ground buckled beneath them with terrifying force, like the earth itself had torn open, releasing something dark and ancient. Luca's heart slammed in his chest as the deep, rhythmic tremor resonated through his bones. He barely had time to register Elena's startled cry before the world around him collapsed. For a moment, the air was thick with dust and the sharp, acrid scent of sulfur. Luca flailed, trying to regain his footing, but the earth was slipping away beneath him, as if the planet was rejecting his very presence. He was falling, but he slammed into something hard, rock, metal, debris, but his body barely reacted, numb with the shock of the sudden drop. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for a split second, all he could hear was the rushing of blood in his ears, the tremors reverberating through the ground. "Elena," he shouted, the words barely making it past his throat. He tried to push himself up, but the pain in his limbs made it difficult. The ground continued to shake, the land seemingly alive beneath him, as if the very planet was pulsating with an ominous energy. His visor was cracked, and a thin layer of dust coated the inside of his helmet, blurring his vision. He wiped it away frantically, fear rising in his chest. Where was Elena? "Luca," her voice came through his communicator, distant but clear. "I'm fine. Just a little shaken." He exhaled in relief, but his heartbeat didn't slow. "Stay where you are. We're too close to the epicenter. We need to get back to the colony, now." "I can't," she said, her tone flat, almost resigned. "I'm not going anywhere until I get the sample." Luca's pulse quickened. "What?" "Elena, no. The Perton is, I know what it is." She cut him off. "But if I don't get this, we'll never be able to study it. You said it yourself. This is the only chance." Luca opened his mouth to argue, but the ground trembled again, more violently this time, and he felt something shift in the atmosphere, like the air had thickened. It wasn't just the tremor now. Something else was moving, something beyond the natural forces of the planet. He could feel it, a presence, something watching them. Something intelligent. "Elena, listen to me," he said, his voice tight. "It's not worth it. We're too exposed. The curtain is close. It's already reacting to our presence. There was a long pause, a breath of hesitation on the other end. Then Elena spoke, her voice low but firm. If we don't get this data, there won't be a colony left to protect. Do you understand? We can't stop it without understanding what it is. Luca's heart skipped a beat. He knew she was right. The curtain was more than just a threat to their survival. It was the planet itself, its guardian, its force of nature. If they didn't figure out how to coexist, they wouldn't just be fighting for resources. They'd be fighting for their lives. I'll cover you, Luca said, finally making up his mind. But we need to move fast. No distractions. He pushed himself to his feet, legs shaky, vision still distorted by the dust and debris. The ground was still trembling, but it was more rhythmic now, like the pulse of something large, something alive, the curtain. They moved as quickly as they could, scrambling over rocks and twisted metal, the distant sound of deep rumbling echoing in their bones. Elena kept her eyes on the readings on her console, her hands steady as she adjusted the equipment, scanning the shifting tendrils that seemed to grow more and more aggressive as they neared the epicenter of the quake. Luca couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and it wasn't just the curtain this time. The planet itself felt alive, aware, conscious of their every move. I'm almost there, Elena called out, her voice tight with concentration. Just a few more meters. Hold on. Luca's eyes flicked around nervously, every sense on high alert. He could feel the curtain's presence more keenly now, the air heavy with its energy. The ground beneath them was no longer just shaking, it was thrumming, vibrating with a palpable intensity, as though the planet was trying to communicate. Then, it happened. A dark, liquid mass exploded from the ground, tendrils lashing out like serpents. They were everywhere, stretching across the landscape, swirling around the mining equipment, and converging on them. Luca froze, heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the curtain was reacting. Elena. Luca shouted, but his voice was lost in the sudden roar of movement. The tendrils were faster than anything he'd seen before, surging toward them like a tidal wave of living matter. He barely had time to react before one of them shot out, wrapping around his leg and lifting him off the ground with terrifying force. The pain was immediate, sharp and burning, like his flesh was being seared by the contact. His vision blurred as he struggled, trying to free himself, but the tendril only tightened, pulling him deeper into the swirling mass. Elena, move! Luca yelled, gasping for air, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Elena was already scrambling backward, her face pale behind her cracked visor, but she didn't have time to escape. The tendrils were too fast, too relentless. Another one shot out, snaking around her waist and lifting her into the air. She kicked and struggled, but the more she fought, the more it seemed to coil around her. Luca, she screamed, her voice muffled by the crackling static of their comms. Get the data. Luca's heart wrenched. The data he had completely forgotten. He was too late to save her. No, he shouted, his mind racing. He fought against the tendrils, but they were like iron, crushing the air from his lungs, tightening around his chest. The pain was overwhelming, but his focus remained fixed on Elena. She was being pulled further into the mass, her arms flailing weakly as she tried to break free. But something was different now. Something was shifting in the atmosphere. Luca felt it in his bones, an almost intelligent awareness, a deliberate force guiding the tendrils. They weren't just attacking, they were communicating, reacting. They knew what they were doing. Please, Luca gasped, almost choking on his own breath. Please don't. He couldn't finish the sentence. Another tendril shot out from the mass, this one moving with terrifying speed, and before Luca could react, it wrapped around his throat, choking him, pulling him closer to the writhing mass. His mind was starting to blur, the world spinning around him in a haze. His vision blackened at the edges, but through the veil of darkness, he saw at them the tendrils, slowing, halting their attack. The mass seemed to pull back just a little, releasing its grip on him. Luca's heart raced. Was it waiting for something? Did it recognize him? It was then, as the tendrils loosened slightly, that Luca realized what he needed to do. He couldn't fight it. Not now. He had to understand it, connect with it, the same way Elena had suggested, the way they had both speculated. With a gasp, Luca let go of his instinct to struggle. He closed his eyes, letting the planet's pulse fill his mind, focusing on the rhythm of the earth, the vibrations, the way it moved. I am not your enemy, he thought desperately, trying to reach it in the only way he could. We need to understand each other. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, no movement, no response, just the oppressive silence of the planet. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tendrils loosened even more, easing their grip on him, and just as suddenly as it had all started, the pressure lifted, the ground ceased its shaking, and the world fell still. Luca collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his limbs trembling from the effort. He didn't know if it was the curtain that had stopped or if it had merely been a temporary truce, but for the first time since he had arrived on Loran, he felt the smallest flicker of hope. The curtain had heard him. It was a start. End of story.